I said that Aglaya was almost as good-looking as Nastasia Philippovna. Ganya asked for more detail. The prince complied. Ganya again gave him a mocking look. You do go on about Nastasia Philippovna, he muttered, but lapsed into thought without finishing. He was obviously alarmed. The prince reminded him about the portrait. Listen, prince, Ganya said suddenly, as if an unexpected thought had dawned on him. I have a huge request to make of you, but I really don't know. He became embarrassed and did not finish. He was venturing upon something and seemed to be struggling with himself. The prince waited silently. Ganya studied him once more with intent, searching eyes. Prince, he began again, right now there, owing to a completely strange circumstance, ridiculous, and for which I'm not to blame, well, in short, it's irrelevant, they're a bit angry with me in there, it seems, so for the time being I'd rather not go there without being sent for. I need terribly to talk with Aglaya Ivanovna now. I've written a few words just in case. A small, folded note appeared in his hand, and I don't know how to deliver it. Would you take it upon yourself, Prince, to deliver it to Aglaya Ivanovna, right now, but only to Aglaya Ivanovna, that is, so that nobody sees, understand? It's not such a great secret, God knows, there's nothing to it, but, will you do it? It's not altogether pleasant for me, said the prince. Ah, prince, it's of the utmost necessity for me. Ganya began to plead. Maybe she'll answer, believe me, only in the utmost, the very utmost case, would I turn to, who else can I send it with? It's very important. It's terribly important for me. Ganya was terribly afraid that the prince would not agree and kept peering into his eyes with cowardly entreaty. Very well, I'll deliver it. But only so that nobody notices, the now joyful Ganya pleaded. And another thing, Prince, I'm relying on your word of honor, eh? I won't show it to anybody, said the prince. The note isn't sealed, but, the much too flustered Ganya let slip and stopped in embarrassment. Oh, I won't read it, the prince replied with perfect simplicity, took the portrait, and walked out of the office. Ganya, left alone, clutched his head. One word from her, and I really may break it off. He started pacing up and down the office, too excited and expectant to sit down to his papers again. The prince pondered as he went. He was unpleasantly struck by the errand, and unpleasantly struck by the thought of Ganya's note to Aglaya. But 2 rooms away from the drawing room he suddenly stopped, seemed to remember something, looked around, went over to the window, closer to the light, and began to look at Nastasia Philippovna's portrait. It was as if he wanted to unriddle something hidden in that face which had also struck him earlier. The earlier impression had scarcely left him, and now it was as if he were hastening to verify something. That face, extraordinary for its beauty and for something else, now struck him still more. There seemed to be a boundless pride and contempt, almost hatred, in that face, and at the same time something trusting, something surprisingly simple-hearted. The contrast even seemed to awaken some sort of compassion as one looked at those features. That dazzling beauty was even unbearable, the beauty of the pale face, the nearly hollow cheeks and burning eyes, strange beauty. The prince gazed for a moment, then suddenly roused himself, looked around, hastily put the portrait to his lips and kissed it. When he entered the drawing room a minute later, his face was completely calm. But as he was going into the dining room, 1 room away from the drawing room, in the doorway he almost ran into Aglaya, who was coming out. She was alone. "Gavrila Ardalionovitch asked me to give you this," said the prince, handing her the note. Aglaya stopped, took the note, and looked at the prince somehow strangely. There was not the least embarrassment in her look, perhaps only a glimpse of a certain surprise, and even that seemed to refer only to the prince. With her look Aglaya seemed to demand an accounting from him. In what way had he ended up in this affair together with Ganya? And to demand it calmly and haughtily. For 2 or 3 moments they stood facing each other. Finally something mocking barely showed in her face. She smiled slightly and walked past him. Mrs. Epanchin studied the portrait of Nastasia Philippovna for some time silently and with a certain tinge of scorn, holding it out in front of her at an extreme and ostentatious distance from her eyes. "Yes, good looking," she said at last, "even very. I've seen her twice, only from a distance." "So that's the sort of beauty you appreciate?" She suddenly turned to the prince. "Yes, that sort," the prince replied with some effort. "Meaning precisely that sort?" "Precisely that sort." "Why so?" "There's so much suffering in that face," the prince said, as if inadvertently, as if he were talking to himself and not answering a question. "You may be raving, however," Mrs. Epanchin decided, and with an arrogant gesture she flung the portrait down on the table. Alexandra picked it up, Adelaida came over to her, and they both began to study it. Just then Aglaya came back to the drawing room. "Such power!" Adelaida cried all at once, peering greedily at the portrait over her sister's shoulder. "Where? What power?" Lizaveta Prokofyevna asked sharply. "Such beauty has power," Adelaida said hotly. "You can overturn the world with such beauty." She went pensively to her easel.